The ground shook with thunderous explosions as shells ripped through the European countryside. Smoke curled into the overcast sky, carrying the acrid scent of burning metal and scorched earth. In the distance, Sherman tanks rolled forward, their engines straining against the mud, their crews bracing for the inevitable. But even as the Allies advanced, a terrifying reality became painfully clear. Panther tanks, sleek and deadly, awaited them like predators in a shadowed forest. Each shot from a Sherman bounced harmlessly off their reinforced armor, leaving soldiers exposed, desperate, and terrified. Inside a dimly lit engineering office far from the front lines, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Chuck Myers leaned over a cluttered drafting table. Blueprints of the Sherman's 75mm gun sprawled before him, covered in numbers, angles, and calculations. Myers' hands were smudged with grease and pencil graphite, his uniform stained from weeks of long nights. Outside, the battle raged, and every loss was a personal torment. He knew the men in those tanks. He knew their fear. And he knew the Sherman, as brave and resilient as it was failing them. The problem seemed insurmountable. The Panthers' armor was not only thick, but angled, deflecting rounds like water off steel. Commanders on the front lines sent frantic reports back. Entire crews wiped out in seconds, Sherman tanks reduced to charred wrecks before they could even fire effectively. Morale was plummeting. Hope was slipping through Allied fingers like sand. And yet, in that quiet office, Myers refused to surrender to despair. He tapped his pencil against the table, eyes narrowing as he studied the rifling of the gun barrel. A thought, small at first, began to take shape, an idea so simple in concept, yet revolutionary in its potential. If he could alter the rifling just so, adjust the trajectory and spin of the round, the Sherman's shells might finally pierce the Panther's armor. The engineers who passed his office shook their heads. "Impossible," they muttered. "You can't change the Sherman overnight. The armor's too strong, the Panther's too deadly." Myers didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew. Innovation was born in the space where others saw failure. Outside, the battle continued. The sound of screams, explosions, and metal tearing filled the air. Myers could hear the distant report of a Sherman's gun, a hollow echo of its futility. Each unsuccessful shot, each crew lost, strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about machinery. It was about lives, about turning the tide of an entire campaign. The Allies were counting on more than brute force. They needed ingenuity, courage, and someone willing to defy convention, and Myers, quiet, unassuming, and relentless, was ready to be that someone. He bent lower over his blueprints, the lines of the Sherman's gun etched into his mind. Somewhere in those calculations lay the answer, a way to make a tank, often mocked by its enemies as underpowered, fire with the lethality of a destroyer. The battle might be raging, the losses mounting, but in that small, dimly lit room, the seeds of a revolution in armored warfare were taking root. And when they finally bore fruit, the war and the men on the front lines would never be the same. The morning fog clung to the French countryside like a shroud, masking the devastation that had spread across the landscape overnight. Sherman tanks, once symbols of hope and firepower, now lay twisted and smoking in fields pockmarked by shell craters. Commanders and soldiers moved among the wreckage in stunned silence, tallying losses that seemed impossible to recover. Lieutenant Colonel Myers' office, miles away from the front, was filled with the hum of typewriters and low murmurs of worried officers, but even here, the weight of the disaster pressed down like the very steel walls of a Panther tank. Reports came in faster than anyone could process. Sherman T-34 hit at 0600 hours. Crew lost. Another destroyed near St. Lay. No survivors. Each report made Myers flinch, each line a grim reminder of the Sherman's shortcomings. He pored over photographs of the wreckage, noting the angles of penetration, or rather, the lack of penetration. Shrapnel and twisted metal told the same story. The 75mm shell simply bounced off the Panther's glacis. Harmless as a pebble thrown against a wall, the Panthers were engineering marvels of a different kind. Their armor was sloped at precise angles, deflecting rounds and absorbing the impact of even high-velocity fire. A standard Sherman shell, traveling at hundreds of meters per second, would glance off or leave only a shallow dent, doing nothing to stop the crew inside. Myers' stomach churned as he read accounts of tanks torn apart from a distance where a Sherman couldn't even retaliate effectively. Soldiers fought bravely, but bravery alone could not rewrite the laws of physics. In his office, Myers spread out technical manuals, ballistic charts, and schematics of the Sherman's gun barrel. He sketched diagrams furiously, tracing the path of a shell as it spun down the barrel. Rifling, spin, velocity, projectile weight, every factor was critical, and the interplay between them fascinated him. But fascination gave way to desperation. Time was running out. Allied offensives depended on armored support, and each day the Sherman remained outmatched. More lives were lost. More ground slipped from their control. He proposed a modification, a subtle adjustment to the rifling of the Sherman's gun that would impart a different spin to the shell, stabilizing it for maximum penetration. It wasn't just theory. Myers had run preliminary calculations and suggested testing with modified barrels. The idea was revolutionary, almost absurd to his colleagues. At meetings with senior officers, he explained the principle, but all he received were skeptical frowns. "You want to rewrite ballistics mid-campaign?" One officer asked. "You're talking about a miracle, Myers. Tanks don't fire like that. Physics doesn't bend for optimism." The bureaucracy was suffocating. Orders, memos, and approvals moved at a glacial pace. Requests for prototype barrels were delayed. Engineers were reassigned, yet Myers refused to let frustration stop him. Every night, after poring over ballistics charts and testing formulas in small-scale models, he returned to the photographs of the battlefield, imagining a Sherman that could strike back with lethal precision. The image of men trapped inside. Those tanks haunted him. He could almost hear their cries, muffled by twisted steel. Outside, the war raged on. Another convoy of Shermans moved into position near a small village in Normandy, unaware of the Panthers lying in ambush. Soldiers laughed nervously, checked their ammunition, and whispered prayers. Myers could see it all in his mind's eye. The shells fired in futile arcs, bouncing harmlessly off enemy armor, tanks destroyed one by one. His hands shook with anger and urgency. There was no time for incremental improvement. The solution had to be daring, precise, and immediate, or more men would die before the next engagement. In the quiet of the night, Myers sketched again, adjusting angles, experimenting with spin rates and rifling twists. Each equation and diagram was a lifeline to the soldiers he might save. He had no troops to command, no tanks under his direct control. Only knowledge and imagination, and yet he realized that could be enough. The skepticism of his peers, the slow-moving bureaucracy, the roaring death of the battlefield, it all became fuel. Myers knew that if he could convince even a single officer to approve his plan, even a single modified gun could make the difference between life and death. As the sun rose the next day, Myers stared at the blueprints with a grim determination. Somewhere in the numbers and calculations lay a weapon more powerful than any tank could carry away to turn the Sherman from prey into hunter, from lumbering cannon fodder into a force that could challenge the Panther. The challenge was immense. Failure could mean disgrace, ridicule, or worse, continued bloodshed. But Myers had already decided he would see this through. No matter the cost, and somewhere in the distant fields of Normandy, Sherman crews readied themselves for another engagement, unaware that one man's mind, working tirelessly behind the lines, might soon change everything. The war was still raging, the stakes higher than ever, and the question hung in the air: could one engineer, armed only with ingenuity, truly rewrite the rules of armored warfare? The hum of the machine shop was constant, a metallic heartbeat in the quiet of the base. Sparks flew intermittently as Myers adjusted tools and instruments, his eyes fixed on the rifling barrels that now dominated every surface of his workspace. Each groove, twist, and angle was meticulously measured, a delicate choreography of mathematics and physics that might just change the course of the war. On a simple wooden table, blueprints were scattered like a battlefield of paper-crumpled notes, erased diagrams and frantic annotations showing the evolution of his idea. Myers leaned closer, tracing the lines of his latest sketch with a pencil, smudged with graphite. This new rifling design was subtle. A slight alteration in the spiral of the barrel meant to impart a unique spin to the 75mm shell. It wasn't about raw power. It was precision, stabilization, and timing. If it worked, a Sherman could punch through the Panther's armor with the accuracy and impact of a much heavier weapon. But the theory had to survive practice, and practice had a way of humbling even the most brilliant minds. The first tests were a cruel reminder of that reality. The shell ricocheted harmlessly, the impact producing a hollow, unsatisfying thud against the armor plate. Myers' hands clenched, jaw tight as he examined the results. The angle had been slightly off, the spin too fast. The velocity miscalculated by a fraction that made all the difference. Outside the test range, the distant echoes of artillery fire reminded him that lives hung in the balance while he tinkered in safety. The weight of that responsibility pressed on him like the steel walls of a tank. Letters from soldiers arrived, daily scattered across the office floor like silent pleas. "We can't keep losing like this," one read. "We trust in the Sherman, but the Panthers, they're killing us." Myers held each letter carefully, reading and rereading them. He imagined the faces of the men, young and terrified, their hands gripping the steering wheels and firing handles while enemy shells tore through their armor. The letters were fuel for his determination and a stark reminder of the stakes. Failure here wasn't just personal, it was fatal for those on the front lines. He worked late into the night, alone except for the mechanical clatter and the faint whirring of fans. Mistakes piled up, each failure heavier than the last, each test that didn't meet expectation a nail in the coffin of doubt. And yet, Myers refused to let it break him. He adjusted his calculations, recalculated velocities, and re-angled rifling spirals with obsessive care. He paced, sometimes muttering numbers under his breath, sometimes standing frozen in thought, imagining the shell traveling through space, spinning perfectly, striking true. The tension was palpable, every heartbeat echoing the uncertainty of the endeavor. Then came the moments of small, fleeting success. A shell struck the target at the intended angle, leaving a shallow but promising indentation. Myers barely breathed, hands hovering over the blueprints as if afraid to disturb the fragile result. He ran tests again and again, each shot a precarious dance of hope and despair. The data showed promise, yet consistency remained elusive. Could he truly replicate this on the battlefield, where conditions were chaotic, unpredictable, and deadly? The pressure intensified as news from the front arrived. Another convoy of Shermans had engaged Panthers near Cannes, several tanks destroyed, crews trapped. Myers stared at the photographs in disbelief, the urgency of the moment gnawing at him. Time was slipping. His idea, still unproven, had to succeed. He began drafting the plan for a live field trial, a controlled test with an operational Sherman. Under supervision, but far closer to the dangers his modifications were designed to counter. The thought of sending men into the unknown weighed heavily, but he knew the risk was necessary. Each night he reviewed every variable again and again. Barrel length, shell weight, powder composition, rifling pitch, all factors to be optimized. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by dreams of burning tanks and screaming crews, followed by flashes of potential solutions, a fractionally adjusted twist here, a slightly heavier round there. Myers scribbled furiously in notebooks, equations, and diagrams cascading across pages, each one a step closer to the elusive breakthrough. By the end of the week, a prototype barrel stood ready, polished, and rifled according to his specifications. Myers examined it under the dim lamp, running his fingers over the grooves as if he could feel the potential within them. The room smelled of oil, metal, and anticipation. For weeks, he had battled failure, doubt, and skepticism, but now the moment of truth was approaching. Soon, a Sherman equipped with this barrel would face the ultimate test. Live combat conditions against the Panther tanks that had haunted every Allied report. As Myers prepared the documentation for approval, he allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. The spark had been struck not in the field, not under fire, but here, in quiet perseverance, intellect, and an unyielding sense of duty. One man's mind, working against time and skepticism, might just be the key to saving countless lives. And when that first modified Sherman fired in anger, Myers knew the world would never see him the same way again. Nor would the men on the front lines see the Sherman the same way. The battlefield waited, ruthless and unforgiving, while a single spark of innovation smoldered in the hands of an engineer who refused to fail. The early morning mist hung low over the rolling fields of Normandy, cloaking the earth in a gray, ghostly haze. The sound of distant artillery rumbled through the valleys like a warning drum. In a small convoy of Shermans advancing cautiously toward a heavily wooded ridge, one tank stood out, not in appearance but in the promise it carried. Its crew knew little of the modifications in its gun barrel. All they knew was that their orders were to advance and engage the enemy. Miles behind, Myers paced nervously, maps and diagrams clutched in his hands, listening to the faint static of a field radio that carried every report, every sound of the unfolding battle. The first Panther appeared suddenly, half hidden behind a line of trees, its massive gun leveling toward the nearest Sherman. The smaller tank fired its standard 75mm round, the shell thudding harmlessly against the Panther's glacis with a hollow echo that made every soldier flinch. In that moment, despair seemed inevitable. Myers' heart pounded as he visualized the destruction, the crew inside the Sherman, trained and courageous, waiting for a miracle that had yet to be tested in battle. Then the modified Sherman rolled forward. Its gun barrel, subtly rifled according to Myers' careful calculations, tracked the Panther with mechanical precision. The crew inside hesitated for a heartbeat, adjusting their aim, not knowing the full potential of the weapon they now commanded. Outside, the rest of the convoy froze in anticipation, every eye on the field as if sensing the tension. Myers gripped the edge of his map, fingernails digging into the paper. This was it, the first true test. The Sherman fired. The shell streaked through the air, a silver blur propelled by physics and ingenuity. It struck the Panther at a perfect angle, hitting the thick armor and vanishing with a deafening impact. A column of smoke erupted as the enemy tank shuddered violently, then toppled onto its side with a metallic groan. The battlefield seemed to pause, a breathless silence following the thunderous collision. Soldiers stared, wide-eyed, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Did we just... A young gunner whispered, voice barely audible over the still resonating echo. The tank commander, usually stoic and reserved, could only stare, a mixture of disbelief and awe etched across his face. Myers, listening from miles away, allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope, but anxiety clenched his chest. One successful strike did not guarantee consistent results, and every soldier's life still hung in the balance. The engagement intensified. Another Panther revealed itself from the tree line, and the modified Sherman's crew adjusted swiftly. The shell spun from the barrel, and with precision and lethal force it tore through the enemy tank's armor. The second strike was cleaner, faster, more decisive. Around the battlefield, Allied soldiers began to regain confidence, advancing with renewed determination. Where moments ago they had faltered under fear, now they pressed forward. Inspired by what seemed like a miracle, Myers exhaled slowly, tension giving way to cautious exhilaration. The calculations, the sleepless nights, the endless sketches, and the relentless testing, all of it had led to this moment. But even as adrenaline surged, he thought of the men who had fallen before this breakthrough, those whose deaths had driven his obsession. Every victory carried the weight of their sacrifice. In that instant he understood the human cost of innovation. The triumph was inseparable from the loss it had sought to prevent. Field reports crackled over the radio. Panther destroyed. Sherman crew intact, enemy retreating. Commanders exchanged stunned glances, orders now laced with a newfound confidence. Myers' modifications had not just proven effective, they had shifted the morale of the battlefield. For the first time, the Sherman was no longer a preyed-upon workhorse. It could fight, it could dominate, it could survive. Soldiers cheered quietly, still wary, still cautious, but hope had begun to seep back into their ranks. Myers, back at the base, allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The breakthrough was as much a victory of mind over matter as it was a technical achievement. A single man's ingenuity, honed through hours of isolation and persistence, had given life to a weapon capable of challenging the enemy's most feared tanks. The battlefield might still be chaotic, but now there was a reason to fight, to believe, and as the modified Sherman rolled forward, its barrel gleaming in the pale sunlight, Myers understood something deeper. The war could not be won by numbers alone, nor by courage alone. It required innovation, creativity, and the courage to defy convention. One tank, one modification, had begun to rewrite the rules of armored warfare. The ripple effect of this first fire would be felt far beyond Normandy, altering strategy, inspiring soldiers, and giving the Allies the edge they desperately needed. The mist lifted slightly, revealing a battlefield transformed not by luck, not by brute force, but by a spark of human ingenuity. Myers stared at the maps and diagrams, heart racing, knowing that this was only the beginning. The Sherman had fired its first decisive shot, but the real test of consistent survival was yet to come. The war would continue, but the tide had shifted, and the shadow of doubt that had loomed over the Allied armored forces had finally begun to lift. The morning after the first confirmed success, Myers sat alone in his office, the soft hum of the base around him a stark contrast to the chaos he had witnessed on the front lines. A single telegram lay on his desk, crisp and formal, bearing the mark of Allied command. Commendation for ingenuity in armored warfare, it read. Quiet praise, understated and official enough to acknowledge the achievement without drawing attention to the man behind it. Myers ran a hand over his face, exhausted, and allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. His work had made a difference. Lives had been saved. The Sherman, once the underdog of armored engagements, had proven itself, yet the quiet celebration was short-lived. At meetings and briefings, the murmurs of skepticism persisted. Senior officers, entrenched in doctrine and habit, raised questions about reliability. One success doesn't make a strategy, an armored division commander said, leaning back in his chair. How do we know this works consistently? What happens under different conditions, different crews? Myers, standing patiently, offered his calculations, diagrams, and early field reports, but he knew numbers could not convince every mind. Innovation always met resistance, and war made minds even more cautious, even rigid. The tension between brilliance and bureaucracy weighed heavily. Approvals for additional modified barrels were slow, sometimes stalling for days as committees debated minor details. Myers found himself repeating the same explanations over and over, watching as the clock ticked while soldiers continued to face Panther fire unprotected. Each delay gnawed at him, a reminder that ingenuity alone could not overcome the inertia of large organizations. Yet he persisted, patient, methodical, refusing to allow frustration to dictate action. In quiet moments, Myers reflected on the human cost of his work. Letters from tank crews still arrived, some shaky and urgent, others filled with relief and gratitude. "We saw one of your tanks today," one wrote. "It was like a ghost from the blueprints. It moved, it fired, and it saved us. Thank you." He read each letter, folding them carefully, storing them as both validation and responsibility. Every message reminded him that each calculation, each sleepless night, had been more than an academic exercise. It had been a lifeline, but the weight of responsibility was also a shadow. Every modification sent to the front, every barrel tested, in combat, carried risk. Myers could not ignore the possibility of failure. The chance that a single miscalculation could undo months of work and cost lives. He thought of the crews, young men with families waiting across the ocean, placing trust in a tank and, indirectly, in him. The emotional burden was immense, but it sharpened his resolve. Hesitation was not an option. Careful, precise innovation was the only path forward, even as recognition slowly spread. Reports from commanders praising the Sherman's improved performance, engineers acknowledging the cleverness of the rifling modification. Myers remained modest. He did not seek the spotlight, and he knew that fame in war was fleeting, often overshadowed by death or misfortune. The quiet knowledge that his work saved lives, that it allowed soldiers to fight with a renewed sense of hope, was reward enough. Yet, deep inside, he could not ignore the unease. Each battle still carried uncertainty, and each success had to be replicated under the harshest conditions. In one meeting, an officer finally voiced what others had only implied. "It's brilliant. Myers, no doubt, but can it be standardized? Can every crew in every Sherman, under every condition, rely on this?" Myers looked around the table, meeting the gaze of each skeptic. His answer was calm, precise, and unwavering. "We will test. We will refine. But we cannot ignore what works because it challenges convention. Lives are at stake. That is the standard we must measure by." There was no argument after that, only the quiet hum of contemplation. As he left the meeting, Myers paused by a window, looking out over the training grounds where modified Shermans rumbled in cautious drills. Soldiers maneuvered tanks, crews practicing target acquisition and firing techniques, unaware of the precise calculations that had made their survival more likely. Myers felt a surge of both pride and responsibility. The battle had shifted, confidence had returned, and innovation had proven its worth, but the war continued. Relentless and unforgiving, he returned to his desk, picked up a letter from a young crewman he had never met, and read it again. "We saw the difference today. We survived. Today, thank you." Myers allowed himself a moment of stillness, absorbing the weight of the accomplishment and the burden it carried. In the quiet, he realized the truth that would guide him in the days to come. Innovation in war was never just about machines or calculations. It was about people, about lives, and about the courage to push forward when the odds seemed insurmountable. And so, Myers prepared for the next step, the broader deployment, the scaling of his work across the armored divisions. Recognition had come, resistance persisted, but he knew that every day, every decision, every careful refinement mattered. The Sherman was no longer just a tank, it was a promise, a shield, and a testament to the power of a single engineer's determination to make a difference. The sun rose over the war-torn fields of northern France, casting a pale light on a landscape still scarred by months of fighting. Rows of Sherman tanks rumbled forward, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. But these were not the same Shermans that had faltered against the Panthers in previous months. These tanks bore the mark of Myers' ingenuity rifled barrels, meticulously modified to give the 75mm shells unprecedented penetration power. Behind each barrel, crews moved with a cautious confidence they had never known before. Reports from forward units indicated the change almost immediately. In a small village near the Belgian border, a convoy of 5 Shermans advanced along a narrow road flanked by fields and hedgerows. Scouts reported enemy Panther positions, and the tanks hesitated only for a heartbeat before engaging. One Panther emerged from behind a cluster of trees, its massive gun leveled at the lead Sherman. The crew held their breath. Then the modified barrel fired. The shell struck with lethal precision, penetrating the thick armor and sending the enemy tank reeling. Another shot, another Panther neutralized. The convoy pressed forward. The previously cautious soldiers now emboldened by the undeniable effectiveness of their weapons. Elsewhere, across the countryside, similar scenes unfolded. Shermans engaged Panthers in ambush that had once been catastrophic for Allied forces. The modified shells tore through armor with the force of a much heavier gun, and for the first time, Allied commanders saw a tangible shift in battlefield balance. Reports of destroyed Panthers and surviving Sherman crews poured in, each one reinforcing the idea that the tide was turning. Commanders in field headquarters leaned over maps, studying reports with renewed hope. "We can finally engage the Panthers head on," one officer remarked, astonishment in his voice. "The Shermans, they can fight them on equal terms." Morale, long battered by repeated losses, surged. Soldiers whispered about the miracle barrels, and even the most skeptical engineers began to acknowledge the brilliance of Myers' work. The Sherman was no longer merely a supporting tool, it had become a weapon capable of dominating the battlefield, a heavy destroyer in its own right. Despite the celebration, Myers remained far from the front lines, observing from his office. and listening intently to every dispatch. He was not a soldier, and he would never hear the roar of battle firsthand. Yet every report of a Sherman striking true, every tale of a crew surviving a previous death sentence, carried the weight of a personal victory. His role was invisible, but essential. The outcome of countless engagements now rested, in part, on the calculations and designs he had painstakingly refined. The human cost was never far from his mind. He thought of the young crews, many of whom had written him letters expressing fear, hope, or gratitude. He imagined the relief on their faces as enemy tanks fell to the modified Shermans, and he allowed himself a brief, silent sense of pride. Yet he also remembered the ones who had already fallen, who had fought and died while his innovations were still on the drafting table. Every victory came tethered to memory, to loss, to the gravity of wartime responsibility. The battles continued. In one engagement near a crossroads outside a small French town, a column of Shermans faced a line of Panthers entrenched behind hedgerows. The initial volley of shells from the first Sherman tore through the armor of two Panthers, the crack of metal and the roar of explosions echoing across the fields. Allied infantry, previously pinned down, surged forward under the protection of tanks that could finally hold their own. Myers listened to the reports with tense anticipation, heart racing as confirmation of success came in. All enemy armor neutralized. No Sherman losses? Across Belgium, the pattern repeated itself. Each engagement reinforced the strategic impact of Myers' work. Allied forces could now consider offensive operations against positions that had once been deemed nearly impregnable. The morale boost among soldiers and commanders alike was palpable. The knowledge that their tanks could withstand and overcome the once dreaded Panther changed the tone of every mission, every advance, every calculation of risk. The battlefield itself had shifted, the scales tipping in favor of innovation and courage. Myers' heroism was indirect, quiet, yet monumental. He did not charge into the fray, did not lead troops with a sword or a gun. Instead, he wielded intellect, patience, and unrelenting determination to engineer a solution that saved lives and altered strategy. Every shell that found its mark, every Sherman that survived where it would have been destroyed before, was a testament to his invisible presence on the battlefield. By the end of the campaign's early phase, the impact was undeniable. Allied forces advanced with renewed confidence, tanks pressed forward in coordinated strikes, and the once feared Panther was no longer the uncontested predator of armored warfare. Myers' work had not only saved lives, it had rewritten the rules of engagement, giving the Allies a tangible advantage in a theater where survival often hung on the narrowest of margins. And as Myers reviewed the latest dispatches, a quiet determination settled over him. The war was far from over, but the spark he had nurtured in a small, dimly lit office had grown into a flame that could no longer be ignored. The Sherman was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol of ingenuity, perseverance, and the quiet power of one man's unwavering commitment to making a difference. The tide had turned, and the battlefield would never look the same again. The war had moved on, battles fought and won, territories reclaimed, and the echoes of artillery gradually fading into history. Lieutenant Colonel Charles "Chuck" Myers sat quietly in his office, the hum of activity around him now a distant murmur compared to the chaos of the front lines. Outside, modified Shermans were still rolling, still performing their silent, lethal duty, but the fighting had shifted. The soldiers who had once relied on hope now relied on a tool he had perfected, and the memory of lives saved weighed heavily and proudly on him. Letters continued to arrive, though fewer now, filled with gratitude from men who had survived engagements that might once have been fatal. "We faced the Panthers today and lived," one read, ink smudged from hurried hands in muddy foxholes. "Your tank fired true. I don't know who you are, sir, but we owe our lives to you." Myers read each message carefully, folding them and storing them like precious artifacts. The words were modest tokens of thanks, but for him they carried the weight of the countless unnamed soldiers who had fallen before the innovation reached the battlefield. Historians would later call Myers' work a turning point in armored warfare, a subtle yet monumental shift that gave the Allies renewed confidence and changed the tactics of tank engagement across Europe. But Myers himself never sought recognition. He understood that true contribution was measured not in medals or accolades, but in the lives preserved, the battles shifted, and the courage inspired. His work remained largely invisible to the world, yet it had left an indelible mark on history. Even now, years later, Myers would reflect quietly on those long nights over blueprints and calculations, the endless tests, the repeated failures, that had almost broken him. Every misfire, every moment of doubt, every letter from the front lines had shaped not only the innovation but the man behind it. He realized that the courage to create, to challenge convention, and to persist against skepticism was inseparable from the courage soldiers displayed on the battlefield. One could not exist without the other. The Sherman, once underestimated and vulnerable, had become a force capable of facing the Panther and surviving. It carried within its steel shell the work of one quiet engineer whose mind had become a weapon, as powerful as any gun or cannon. Myers' legacy was not in headlines or parades, but in the survival of thousands of men, in the renewed hope of a weary army, and in the reassurance that ingenuity could turn the tide even in the darkest hours of war. As he looked out over the base, watching a young crew practice maneuvers in a gleaming Sherman, Myers allowed himself a small smile. He had never sought glory, only solutions, only the knowledge that he had done what he could to protect those who risked everything. And in that reflection he understood something profound. The bravery of a soldier facing enemy fire and the bravery of an engineer facing uncertainty were threads of the same courage, woven into the fabric of history. One man's quiet genius, his refusal to accept defeat, had changed the outcome of armored warfare. And in that change, the lives of countless soldiers were spared, their courage magnified by the invisible hand that guided their survival. Myers had proven, in ways both subtle and monumental, that innovation and courage were inseparable, and that the war, for all its terror, could be fought not just with weapons but with ideas.